Happy Saturday night, horror fam, and welcome to day 12 of Halloween season. Tonight we're diving into a special theme, scary fairy tales, where the beloved stories of our childhood take on a much darker twist. Tonight we're starting off with a personal favorite of mine, the Brothers Grimm classic, Bearskin. This story, while not horror in the traditional sense, has stuck with me ever since I was a kid, and I'm thrilled to finally share it here. It was originally posted as a Patreon exclusive, but tonight, it's for everyone. After Bearskin, we'll venture into some truly chilling retellings of well-known fairy tales, from Beware the Howls, the boy who cried Wolf's Nightmare, to Goldilocks and the Three Werebears, and a dark new take on Little Red Riding Hood. Tonight's stories will make you rethink the fairy tales you grew up with, so grab a blanket, settle in, and get ready for a night of twisted tales that will send shivers down your spine.
The war was over, but Heller had nowhere to go. He was an excellent soldier, hard and fearless. But with the war being over, he found himself in a world that had no room for him. His parents had died, and he had no family. So with no food or money, Heller wandered the Black Forest. It was getting late, and the evening air quickly moved from cool to cold. Heller built a fire, hoping it would bring him some comfort, but his stomach was empty, so it was difficult for him to sleep. He lied back, looked up at the stars, and lamented. What am I to do? Pray for war? And if there isn't another war, am I to starve to death? Just then, Heller could hear someone approaching him in the distance. He readied his gun. Bandits were uncommon, but it was late and hard to imagine why anyone would be walking about. Heller locked his gaze on where the footsteps were coming from and saw a man step out from behind a tree.
"Good evening, soldier," the man called. "I have the answer to your troubles. Gold and treasure, all that you can carry, enough to last all of your days."
It was dark. Heller could barely make out the man talking to him. "You have my attention, sir. Come forward and let us reason." The man stepped forward. He looked to be around Heller's age. He wore a green coat and had one cloven hoof. Heller could immediately tell this was no man, but the devil.
"I do not, however, bestow my money in vain. Only the fearless are worthy of what I have to give."
"I am a soldier. It is my only trade. The bravest, the very tip of the spear. You are welcome to put me to the proof."
"Very well then, soldier. Tell me, what's that behind you?"
Heller spun around and saw a large bear-like creature charging towards him. Just as he said, without fear or hesitation, he focused his eyes on the hairy brute, and with one perfect shot put him to rest. The devil smirked at Heller.
"You do have courage. You were right to call yourself the tip of the spear. But there is one more condition that needs to be satisfied before I can bestow my riches upon you."
"I will not trade you for my salvation."
"Trade? No, not a trade. A test of your will and fortitude. You must agree to not wash yourself, groom your hair or beard, cut your nails, or say a single prayer for 7 years.
"And how will I be able to find work in such a state?"
"Work? You will have no need for work. I will give you a fur cloak. Whenever you put your hand in its pocket, you will find it full of gold coins. You will, however, not be able to take off this cloak for 7 years. If you break any of this agreement, your soul will be mine. If you die before the 7 years is up, your soul will be mine. But if you satisfy my conditions, you will have riches for the entirety of your life. What say you, soldier?"
Heller collected his thoughts. He faced death many times on the battlefield, and was victorious. He looked the devil in the eye and agreed to his terms. The devil immediately pulled the skin off that bear-like monster and fashioned it into a cloak.
Here is your cloak, soldier. Because you will not be able to take it off for the next 7 years, you will be known as Bearskin.
Heller put his hand in the cloak's pocket and could feel coins. He pulled out 2. They were both gold. When he looked up in astonishment, the devil had already disappeared. Heller ran to town quickly as he could, found a tavern, and ordered himself a fine meal. The night passed easily, and he was happy with the decision he made. For the first year, his appearance was passable. Combined with his kindness, generosity, and warm disposition, he enjoyed the company of many. But by the second year, he began to look like a monster. His hair, beard, and nails were all unruly, and his face and hands were dirty. Only the poor would associate with him, because he was always generous with them. He would ask them to go pray to God to protect him, because he was unable to pray for himself. Because he paid so well, he was always able to find shelter, even though his appearance had become more and more horrid. During his 4th year, he came to an inn, but the owner scolded him and ordered him to leave immediately. Heller quickly reached into his pocket and offered the owner the gold coins. The owner accepted the gold coins, but told Heller he needed to stay in an outhouse and out of sight because he didn't want his inn's reputation tarnished by the sight of a beggar on the property. Heller sat in his room and silently wished for the 7 years to end. No matter what he did or said, he was treated as an outcast, or sometimes worse. Sometimes, he was treated as a monster. The sight of him would make children cry and adults gasp. He could feel tears welling up in his eyes, and his heart was heavy. As he sat quietly, he heard a man crying in the room beside his. Heller got up and walked into the man's room. The man's crying turned to screaming, and he ran across the room trying to shield himself from what he thought was a monster. Once the man heard Heller speak, his mind was put at ease. Heller might have looked like a monster, but he spoke softly, and his words were genuine. Heller asked the man about his troubles, and the man told him he was going to be put in jail. He was a businessman, but he was robbed by his partner. Without money to pursue his old partner or to pay his debts, he expected to be jailed and knew his daughters would starve. Heller asked the man about his debts, and he listed them all. After the man was done, Heller reached into his pocket and pulled out a few gold coins, then reached in again and pulled out a few more. He did it over and over to the man's amazement, until the total of all the man's debts and what was stolen from him sat before him. Heller told the man if he promised to not pursue his partner, but instead would pay off his debt, take care of his daughters, and say a prayer for God to protect him, a monster, that the money would be his. The man could not believe what he heard. He grabbed Heller's hands and kissed them. He told Heller he was not a monster, but an angel, and promised he would do as he said. Heller's spirit was lifted. The man was the first person to touch him in years. The man's hand felt soft, much softer than his own coarse hands. The man stood up and examined Heller. He looked at his eyes and said, "You are an angel. Please, I have 3 daughters, 3 beautiful daughters. Please come see them tomorrow. Maybe you would like one of them and marry them." Heller was so confused. He replied to the man, "You would take a monster for a son?" "My daughters would be lucky to have an angel for a husband, and I one for a son. Tomorrow we will go see my daughters. Let's rest now. I can't believe I'm going to see them tomorrow. I thought I'd never get to see them again." Heller went back to his room and slept well for the first time in a very long time. The next day, Heller went with the man to his house. He told his daughters everything that happened. His two oldest daughters treated him cruelly. They mocked his appearance and how he smelled. Heller lowered his head, once again broken and ashamed. It wasn't the man's fault. Heller was a fool to believe. Just as the man's two eldest daughters were leaving the room, laughing and carrying on about the monster their father brought home, his youngest daughter Emma walked in. She was out picking flowers and came when she heard her sisters laughing. The man told his daughter Emma everything he told her sisters, about how they were going to starve and he was going to be jailed, about how Heller saved them. He then told Emma that Heller was looking for a wife. Emma grabbed Heller's hand, thanked him, and said, "Why would God make an angel and leave him lonely? I think we should wash him up soon, so we can see what an angel really looks like." Underneath his dirt and hair, Heller smiled for a moment, but realized things would only get worse for him here. His beautiful bride-to-be wouldn't wait an additional 3 years for him to wash up and them to be married. Heller told Emma he needed to go on a business trip and would return in about 3 years. If he didn't return, it would mean he was dead, and she was free from her promise. Then he took off his ring and broke it in half. He wrote Heller on one half and gave it to her, and wrote Emma on the other half and put it in his pocket. Then Heller said goodbye to the man and his bride-to-be Emma, and disappeared into the wilderness. When Emma's sisters returned, they took great delight in mocking her, telling her that bears were not known to be gentle husbands, so she must always do as he likes, and bears enjoy sweet things, so maybe she will be eaten. Emma sat quietly and prayed for God to protect Heller on his journey and bring him back to her safely. For the next 3 years, Heller was forced to roam from place to place. Staying anywhere long would make locals angry. He continued being generous and helped the poor, and always asked them to pray for him. At last, the 7 years were up. Heller made his way into the woods as he had 7 years earlier. As the air moved from cool to cold, Heller built a fire and waited. He heard the wind moving through the trees, and then heard a rustling. Something was approaching. It was the devil. The devil looked cross. He approached Heller and threw him his old coat. Heller looked down at his coat and said, "And the gold you promised to bestow." The devil could barely look at Heller.
For the rest of your life, whenever you reach into your coat pocket, you will find gold coins there.
All at once, Heller threw off the bearskin, picked up his old coat, and reached into the pocket. Just as the devil said, every time he reached in, there were more gold coins. Heller ran and washed himself best he could in the woods, and then went into town. He had his nails and hair cut, and was shaved. He gave generously to the poor and thanked them for their prayers. He bought himself fine clothes, and commissioned a carriage to take him to his bride's father's house. When he arrived, he discovered the man died in his absence of old age. Only his daughters remained, and none of them recognized him. He was mistaken for a businessman from out of town, and was quickly invited in. The man's eldest 2 daughters competed for his attention, offering him food and wine. They reasoned they had never seen a more handsome man. He told them he was a successful businessman, and because he heard the most beautiful woman lived in this house, he came hoping to marry her. At that moment, the 2 eldest ran off to their bedrooms to put on fancy dresses, hoping they would be chosen by the stranger. As soon as they were out of the room, Heller looked up at Emma. Aren't you going to run off and put on a dress? Emma looked up at him. No, I'm waiting, you see. Years ago an angel came and saved my family from ruin, but he had to leave me for a time. I'm sure he also waits. And with that, Heller pulled his half of the ring out of his pocket and offered it to Emma. Emma lined up the two halves and knew Heller had come back for her. The two were embracing as Emma's sisters entered the room, and they discovered the nobleman was Heller, the formerly hideous beast they mocked. They ran out of the house in a fit of rage. One of them threw herself in the well and drowned, and the other hung herself from a tree. That night there was a knock at the door. When Heller answered, he saw the devil standing there. "What business do you have here, devil?"
None. At least not with you. I've just come to tell you I will be collecting 2 souls tonight in place of your 1,
he said smugly.
Farewell, Heller.
And the devil walked out into the night, and Heller never heard from him again.
The program features a clown named Bobble, who interacts with the viewers and encourages them to engage in dangerous and harmful activities. SCP-993.
Once upon a time, in a small village surrounded by a dark, dense forest, there lived a young boy named Luke, who had a mischievous habit of crying wolf when there was no wolf around. The first time he did this, the villagers dropped everything they were doing and rushed to his aid. Armed with whatever they had on hand, they set off on a desperate hunt for a wolf and wouldn't rest until one was dead. He did it again. And again, everyone dropped what they were doing and killed another innocent wolf. By the third time the boy had cried wolf, the villagers had become quite adept at tracking and slaying these majestic beasts. Luke basked in his newfound fame, convinced that he had made the village safer by ridding them of these dangerous wolves. All thanks to him. Unbeknownst to him, the senseless spilling of innocent wolf blood had drawn the attention of Fenner, the formidable wolf demon. Fenner rarely meddled in human affairs. He understood the delicate balance between wolves and humans. Wolves sometimes preyed on livestock, and humans occasionally hunted wolves. The system was balanced, but this situation was different. These 3 wolves had been targeted without reason and ruthlessly slaughtered. Feeling compelled to intervene, Fenner decided to grant the 3 fallen wolves a chance for revenge. However, their physical bodies were ravaged beyond repair, so Fenner used his demonic magic to allow them to return as vengeful spirits. These 3 ghost wolves, fueled by their newfound spectral powers and driven by a desire for vengeance, made their way back to the village from the spirit world. Their eerie howls echoed through the night as they ran through the town. Even the townsmen, who were fairly proficient wolf hunters, were afraid. The encounter didn't make any sense to them. Wolves would eat some livestock here and there, but they would never get this close to the town. The spectral wolves roamed the streets. Livestock fell prey to their ghostly fangs. Anything left outside at night was destroyed. The townspeople woke up the next day to their town in shambles. Desperate and angry, they gathered their weapons and torches, setting out into the foreboding forest to hunt down the wolves responsible for the chaos. Driven by a combination of fear and determination, they ventured deeper into the woods. Yet the ghost wolves left no tracks to follow. The villagers did, however, stumble upon the trail of another innocent wolf and began to pursue it, oblivious to their mistake. Before long, the innocent wolf had been tracked down. It was surrounded and about to become the focus of the townmen's wrath. One of the townsmen lassoed the terrified wolf, and then another and another. The ropes all pulled against the wolf's neck in different directions. It tried to let out a howl, but all that came out was a broken croak. Just as the townsmen closed in on their target, the 3 ghost wolves suddenly emerged from the shadows, confronting the villagers in a haunting display of supernatural power. The trapped wolf regained its freedom and hurriedly ran deep into the woods, away from the men. The townspeople were taken aback, realizing the true nature of their adversaries. The ghost wolves stood taller than any wolf the men had ever seen. Their eyes looked like flames, and their coal-black fur gave off smoke. The ghost wolves, enraged by the humans' relentless pursuit of their kind, launched a ferocious attack. The villagers fought back with all their might, but their weapons merely passed through the ethereal forms of the vengeful spirits, leaving them utterly useless. The battle was intensely one-sided, with the ghost wolves' spectral claws and fangs ripping through the townsmen. The screams of the men filled the air. Overwhelmed by the relentless onslaught, the men began to retreat, fleeing backwards towards their village. The wolves pursued. As the frantic townsmen retreated from the forest, their terror-filled screams echoed through the air, reaching the ears of the villagers who stayed behind. Panic quickly spread as the men shouted their urgent warnings. "Get to the church! Save yourselves!" The townspeople, gripped by fear, surmised that these ghostly wolves must be demonic in nature, creatures spawned from the darkest depths of the underworld. They believed that only the power of holy magic could vanquish such vile beings. With no time to spare, the villagers scrambled to gather their families, rushing towards the church as a sanctuary from the encroaching terror. The priest, hearing the commotion outside, opened the church doors and welcomed the frightened villagers inside. As they huddled together in the dimly lit church, the priest prepared for a confrontation with the spectral wolves. He called upon the divine powers of his faith, readying sacred relics and holy water to drive back the otherworldly threat. Meanwhile, outside of the church walls, the ghost wolves closed in on the village, their eerie howls echoing throughout the town. The ghostly wolves reached the church grounds, but they hesitated to enter, respecting the sanctity of the holy place. The priest, witnessing the wolves' reluctance, took it as a confirmation of their demonic nature. He mustered his courage, stepped out of the church, and brandished a cross while clutching a vial of holy water. The wolves waited patiently, observing the priest's every move, knowing that the sacred grounds of the church offered him protection. The priest cleverly stood within the church's boundaries and hurled the holy water at one of the wolves. He expected it to writhe in pain or vanish into thin air, but none of that happened. Instead, the wolf gazed at the priest intently, and in a deep growling voice that sent shivers down the priest's spine, spoke. "Where is Luke?" Overwhelmed by confusion and fear, he retreated back into the church, slamming the door shut behind him. The villagers, anxious and desperate for answers, swarmed around the priest, bombarding him with questions. What happened? Did the wolf really speak? What should we do now? The priest, trying to calm the crowd down, recounted his encounter, and did not hide how the wolf asked for Luke. Turning to the boy, he demanded an explanation for the wolf's interest in him. Luke, feeling the weight of the villagers' gaze, lied once more, saying, "I've been doing such a great job protecting the village from wolves. They must be upset about it." One of the townsmen from the earlier hunting party spoke up, recalling that the ghost wolves had appeared when they cornered another wolf. This lent credibility to Luke's story, and the villagers desperate for answers seemed to be willing to accept his explanation. However, the priest, being a wise and perceptive man, found it strange that the wolves would specifically ask for Luke, rather than target the townsmen involved in the hunting party. He couldn't shake that there was more to this supernatural mystery than met the eye. Summoning all the courage he could muster, the priest stepped outside once more to confront the ghostly wolves. "Luke is just a boy. He's never killed a wolf. Why not ask about the huntsman, or one of the villagers who took part in the hunting parties?" In response, the wolf spoke again in its deep growling voice. "For hundreds of years, the people of this village have respected the natural balance. Luke has disrupted that balance. He must be stopped, so we've come to take him to the spirit world, where he cannot disturb the balance any longer. We've come for Luke, but we'll take others too. Until now, we've respected the hollow ground of the church,
Because the church has been fair. But if the church will hide the wicked, the church will stop being counted as just, and we will come in and take what we need to restore the natural order.
The priest, stunned silent by the wolf's ominous warning, knew that he could not protect Luke or the other villagers by hiding them within the church. With a heavy heart, the priest retreated inside to relay the wolf's message to the villagers. The villagers, more frightened than they had ever been, refused to believe the wolf's words. They labeled the spectral creatures as liars, claiming that their demonic nature made them untrustworthy. As the priest tried to reason with them, the townspeople grew increasingly agitated, accusing him of being a coward and insisting that the wolves would be unable to breach the hallowed ground of the church. Realizing that he needed to act for all of their sakes, the priest asked everyone to quiet down so he could think for a moment. He looked around the church, observing the symbols of faith that adorned the walls, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. In a clear, firm voice he declared, "We can beat them. I know how to send those wolves back to hell." The villagers, invigorated by his words, eagerly awaited his instructions. The priest quickly formulated a plan. "In the basement, we have bottles of wine used for communion. I need all of the men to go there and gather all of them. And in the back, there's some fine tapestry depicting some of the greatest acts of faith recorded in the Bible. I need all the women to go and carefully cut these into strips. Quickly, go now!" As the villagers hurried to fulfill his request, the priest seized the opportunity and grabbed Luke and pulled him outside. The boy panicked, screaming and begging for help. His cries alerted the townspeople, who immediately rushed back to the church door, shouting at the priest and demanding to know what was happening. The priest, determined to resolve the situation, addressed the ghostly wolves. He proposed a temporary deal. If the wolves truly respected justice, they would allow him to approach safely with Luke. In order to do so, he would need to step off the hallowed ground of the church. Otherwise, the townspeople might intervene and endanger them all. The wolves remained silent, but took a step backwards, seemingly agreeing to the priest's request. With a deep breath, the priest stepped off the church property, holding onto Luke firmly. The villagers watched from the doorway. Fear and confusion etched on their faces as they witnessed the exchange between the priest, the boy, and the spectral wolves. As the priest held on to Luke, fear overtook the boy, and he began to shout the truth. The townspeople listened in horror as Luke confessed to his deceitful actions that had led to the destruction of their village. The realization that some of their bravest men had perished due to Luke's lies filled the villagers with a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. The priest, now armed with the truth, turned to the ghostly wolves and pled for the wolves to show mercy and spare the villagers from further harm. He swore he would personally see to it that the delicate balance between humans and wolves would be restored. The wolves exchanged glances, and the one in the center gave a nod. The other two swiftly positioned themselves between Luke, the priest, and the church doors, discouraging the villagers from any rash actions. The central wolf spoke again. 3 lives for 1 is a bargain. The priest interrupted. Very well. Take me. He reassuringly rubbed the back of Luke's neck, took a deep breath, and confidently closed his eyes. A sense of peace washed over him as he awaited his fate. The wolf spoke again. Fenner's magic does not come cheap. The price was the boy. The priest opened his eyes, realizing that the wolves were not interested in taking his life in place of Luke's. They were determined to restore the balance that had been disrupted by the boy's deceit, and the villagers would have to face the consequences of their actions. Luke looked up at the priest with tear-filled eyes, begging him to change what was done, but it was impossible. He couldn't take back the past. The ghostly wolves slowly approached the priest and Luke. The priest spoke again. You said 1 life for 3 was a bargain. The wolves stopped in their tracks. Fenner can be reasoned with, can't he? What will he do with the boy? Consume his energy? Manipulate it? Use it as a plaything? If he could do that with the weak energy derived from a lying child, imagine what he could do with a priest's energy. The village fell completely silent. Not a single sound could be heard. No birds, no breeze, no breaths. The wolf asked the priest if he fully understood the consequences of his proposal. He would be ripped apart, just as they had been, to have his life essence extracted. That essence would then be given to Fenner, who would use it however he pleased. The priest understood and agreed, and sent Luke back into the church. The wolves surrounded the priest. Many of the women and children were moved to the back of the church, far from the door. Luke tried to join them, but the townsmen held him at the door, demanding that he watch the outcome of his actions. Luke watched, horrified, as the wolves lunged at the priest and tore him apart, his blood spilling in front of the church. When it was done, the ghostly wolves disappeared. The village men ran out and collected their fallen hero, the brave priest. They could never forget the lesson they learned, and they vowed to rebuild their village in a way that respected the delicate balance between man and nature. And Luke, bearing the heavy burden of guilt, would spend the rest of his life striving to atone for his mistakes and honor the priest's sacrifice. And peace was restored to the once tranquil community.
And encountering a faceless entity referred to as SCP-087-1.
"Hurry, before it gets too dark," her mother warned. The candles danced weakly. Red packed the cupcakes and thermos of soup into her bag. It was only a 15-minute walk to Grandma's house. She would be okay. The candles cast long shadows on the wall as the mother and daughter packed all the goodies to be delivered to Grandma. "If you get lost or scared, phone me. I'll come and pick you up," her mother told her, with a touch of fear in her voice. Red's little trips to Grandma's always made her feel uneasy. Growing up, herself, she heard countless stories of the menace in the woods that preyed on children, but they were just that, stories. It was getting dark. Clouds rolled through the sky, covering the setting sun. This wouldn't make things too difficult. She could always use her cell phone's flashlight. It's not like it was when her mother was a girl, and children would be forced to blindly make their way home in the dark. A cell phone really is an amazing device. It not only acted as a flashlight, but could show her mother exactly where she was, and could immediately connect her to local police. Packed and ready, Red's mother gave her a kiss on the cheek, coupled with a tight hug and the parting words of, "Be safe, honey, and stay on the path. I love you." Hood on and bag on her back, Red walked out the door, calling back her love and affection to her mother. Red wasn't alone in her fear of the menace. Every child raised in these woods has heard the stories of the menace many times. Though when she was out walking at night, these stories often played over in Red's head. In every bush she could see it, behind every tree she walked around, she expected the menace to be waiting. She began to hear footsteps keeping pace with her as she walked. She knew it wasn't really there, but the thoughts were scary all the same. Red pulled out her cell phone and turned on the flashlight. It wasn't dark yet, but the bright light was comforting. She glanced over her shoulder, having felt the sensation of someone walking in tandem with her. All that accompanied her was her shadow. Breathing a sigh of relief, she set her eyes back upon her path. A blur shot across her path, a good few yards ahead of her. Unsure of what it was in the dark, Red began to run. The phone light bounced as she ran, causing shadows to dance all around her. Maybe it was a dog, she thought, or a raccoon. She didn't know what she saw, but she knew it moved quickly. After a few minutes of running, she hid behind a tree to catch her breath. She put her flashlight in her pocket so it wouldn't cast a light that could be used to tell where she was. It was quiet. Red took advantage and took several deep breaths. She considered calling her mother, but reasoning took over, and she figured calling her would mean she would have to wait there, in the dark. That wouldn't be possible, especially since she could now hear something coming towards her. Red could feel her face becoming hot. She took out her flashlight again and ran. She could hear something running after her. Tears began to stream down her face. What if it's the menace? She thought to herself. This caused her eyes to swell with tears as she ran. She pawed at her eyes, trying to wipe them clear while running as fast as she could. The tears made the trip even more difficult. She could barely see in the dark as it was, and now what could be seen was blurry due to the tears in her eyes. That's when it happened. Something charged at Red. She had no time to react. The menace was real. Her screams pierced the treetops. Her phone fell to the ground as she was knocked over. Still partially blind from her tears, she looked up, in the darkness, at what stood before her. It appeared to be a wolf, although somewhat human. It was covered in hair, and the snarls it let out shook Red to her core. It stood over the vulnerable child, snapping at her. Red closed her eyes and covered her head. She screamed as loud as she could. But who was going to hear her? A young girl screaming all alone in the woods. The snarling stopped, but Red didn't notice, as her sobs drowned out all other sounds. She lifted her head, slowly, unsure if it was a trick to expose herself. Not too far in the distance, she saw a torchlight bouncing towards her, and could hear her grandmother's worried cries ringing out in the night. "Red! Red, dear! I'm coming, sweetheart!" Red had never been so happy to see her grandmother. "Grandma," Red stuttered. "It's real, Grandma! The menace is real! It chased me and attacked me!" Red clutched her grandmother and began to sob again. "Honey, you just tripped and fell on the path. I could just about make you out from my porch. You bolted towards me. I thought you could see me. The next thing I knew, you went head over heels on the ground." Red shook her head and tried to argue. Her grandmother cradled her head and soothed her. "Let's get you home and put something on this scraped knee." Phone forgotten, Grandma and Red walked slowly to her grandmother's house. Red set her bag down on the kitchen table and sat heavily on the chair. Her knee was bleeding, and she winced in pain. "Just 1 second, dear," Grandma told her. "Let me get you something to help with that." Red sat, clutching at her knee, tears still rolling gently down her cheek. She immediately began to feel better. Her grandma's kitchen rekindled fond memories of baking and good cooking. She loved coming to Grandma's house. Grandma returned, first aid kit in hand. Red felt whole again. Grandma pinched her cheeks and smiled. "Oh my, aren't you healthy looking?" she exclaimed. "You're so cute. I could just eat you." They both laughed and hugged each other. Grandma stood up before saying, "Red dear, it's been so nice having you over. There's someone I want to introduce you to." As she gestured to the doorway, Red looked up and felt her heart sink. It walked in upright, face twisted in a snarl. It was a man, but also a wolf. The teeth. Oh God. Red could see them clearly now. Its eyes were cold and dead. It was a nightmare personified. "He's my little pet, dear, and he's been dying to eat you. Oh, I mean, meet you."
They are chameleons. They disguise themselves to gain the public's trust.
Goldie drove down the winding road, her heart fluttering in anticipation. Goldie's what her friends called her. Her real name was Chloe. but she'd been called Goldie since she was a child because of her blonde hair. She was traveling from Pennsylvania to New York, to what was supposed to be one of the biggest haunted houses in the country. The website promised acres of scares, some food vendors, and a stage that would sometimes have live entertainment. The moon turned the asphalt into a silver path, and elongated tree shadows seemed to dance along her car as she drove. She hummed a tune playing on the radio, her fingers tapping on the steering wheel. But as she ventured deeper into the dense woods, the song on the radio became garbled. She assumed it was just poor reception, but it was far worse. Immediately after the radio dying, the engine shut off, and the car coasted to a stop. Goldie picked up her phone and tried calling AAA, but she didn't have a signal. She turned off her car's lights, thinking adding a drained battery to her car's troubles would only make things worse. She got out and began circling around her car with her phone in the air, hoping for a little cell phone service, but her position didn't matter. It was a dead zone. The absence of the engine's hum made the forest stillness even more pronounced. Taking a deep breath, she scanned her surroundings. In the woods, a faint glimmer in the distance caught her eye. A house. She began walking into the woods towards it. They should have a phone, she thought to herself. Her first steps were strong. They were placed with an air of enthusiasm and confidence. But after a while, her steps felt heavy. A combination of her creeping anxiety and her realizing the house was much farther than she originally thought. From her car, it looked like there was a cozy home just a little beyond the tree line in the woods. But the more she walked, the more she realized it wasn't a simple home. It was huge. It was just far away. Luckily, the lights were on, or she never would have seen it from the road. With each step, the house seemed to get bigger. Pausing for a moment, Goldie glanced back, searching for the familiar glow of her car's reflectors. But she couldn't see them. She could get back to her car if she wanted to, but seeing the car through the brush wasn't possible, like the trees were somehow enveloping her past tracks. She felt a pit forming in her stomach as she realized if she couldn't see her car, someone on the road would not be able to see her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, in the towering trees between her and the car, Goldie noticed some shadowy figures stirring. They moved with a predatory grace, their forms shifting with the shadows, and their eyes reflecting the moonlight. Their eyes were hauntingly beautiful, until they fixated on a deer. In the blink of an eye, these two monsters jumped down from the trees and completely overwhelmed the deer. All at once, they ravenously ripped away at its flesh, as if the monsters had never eaten before. A cold rush of adrenaline surged through Goldie as she slowly backed up. The monsters were eating the deer so quickly, they'd be done in a minute, 2 minutes tops. It wasn't safe out there, and she would need to run past them to get to her car. There was no way she was going to take that risk. All at once, she broke out into a sprint, running as fast as she could towards the house in the woods. Goldie reached the house quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first glance, it looked like any other cottage tucked away in the woods. But as she got closer, its exaggerated features became undeniable. Every house detail was amplified. The windows were huge, stretching wider and taller than any she'd seen before. But what really caught her attention was the door. It loomed before her, a good 9 feet tall, and proportionally wide, making her feel like a small child about to enter a giant's home. A giant or not, Goldie didn't care. That deer wouldn't keep those shadowy figures busy for much longer. She quickly pulled open the gigantic door, stepped inside, and with a bit of effort managed to shut the massive door behind her. Taking no chances, she locked it, the heavy bolt thudding into place, granting her a momentary feeling of safety. Goldie tried to catch her breath. The large main hall was adorned with old portraits and grand chandeliers, their candles barely flickering. Thank God for them. If not for the candles, she wouldn't have seen the house from the road. As her gaze wandered, she was surprised by the sight of a child, locked in a cage. The child looked up, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Goldie's heart raced. Questions swirled in her mind. Who could have done this? What kind of person puts a child in a cage? Was this some twisted trap for anyone unfortunate enough to venture into these woods? The size of the door, the cage, everything hinted at the possibility of someone far more formidable residing in this house. Her thoughts raced. If they would cage a child, what would they do to her? Pushing her fear down, she approached the cage cautiously, gently pressing her finger against her lips in a shh gesture. The child and her locked eyes, sharing a silent understanding. Goldie got close and whispered, "Are you okay?" The child nodded silently, "Yes." "I'm hungry." "Okay. I need to call the police, but my phone doesn't work here. Do you know if there's a phone in this house?" "Yeah, there's a phone in the kitchen," the young boy replied. "I can take you there if you need me to." And the child pointed to a key on a hook on the wall behind Goldie. Goldie thought about it a moment. She was so scared of making noise. Even the thought of walking to the wall behind her to get the key sounded risky. But opening random doors praying to find the kitchen sounded scary too. And as terrible as it sounded, if the child led the way and walked into a room with the house's owners, the child might keep the owner busy long enough for her to get away. As she unlocked the cage, she gave the child a warning. "Remember, we have to be quiet and go straight to the kitchen so I can use the phone." The child gave a nod, grateful to be let out. And together they began their cautious trek deeper into the mysterious house. Goldie followed closely behind the child, their tiny footsteps surprisingly assertive against the wooden floorboards as they made their way through the dim corridors. Goldie's eyes were drawn to the walls. Large, erratic scratches and gashes marred the otherwise pristine woodwork. It looked as if a wild animal had tried to claw its way through. What was this place? The child led her to a set of double doors, pushing them open to reveal the kitchen. Immediately, Goldie's senses were assaulted by a horrible odor. It was a mixture of stale air and something rotten. At the center of the room was a large wooden table, lit by a few randomly placed candles. Various dishes and plates were spread out, but the source of the smell was evident, a pot of meat stew that sat in the middle of the entire thing. Without hesitation, the child made a beeline for the table, quickly scooping up a spoonful of the stew and gulping it down. Goldie watched in horror and slight disgust. The meat, illuminated by the flickering candles, looked undercooked, and its origin was questionable. "Wait!" Goldie whispered sharply, pointing to the old rotary phone on the wall. "Just let me make the call first, and then we can get you some good food." The child paused, locking eyes with Goldie. "But I'm so hungry," they whimpered, their small voice filled with desperation. Goldie approached the phone and picked it up, trying to be as quiet as possible. She felt her heart sink. The line was dead. Tracing the cord to the wall, she found it had been chewed through. Panic settled in, knowing their one hope of contacting the outside world was now gone. Distracted by her discovery, she missed the child's attempt to reach another plate of food. A loud screech filled the room as the child's fingers met the scalding hot contents of a dish at the head of the table. The plate was hastily pushed away, its contents spilling on the floor, and the plate shattering. The sudden noise echoed through the house, and almost instantly a series of heavy thuds echoed from above. The child's face went pale. "Oh no!" he murmured, his voice trembling. "We woke up Grandpa! He's more dangerous at night! We need to hide downstairs!" Goldie barely had time to react as the child's hand wrapped around her own, pulling her away from the kitchen into a door in the hall that she'd noticed before but assumed was a closet. As soon as they were behind the door, she realized it was not a closet. It was the entrance to the cellar. In the darkness, she could feel the child pulling her down. Goldie instinctively pulled out her cell phone, turning on its flashlight. The dim light revealed a narrow wooden staircase that the child was trying to get her down with all of his might. He clearly was familiar with the cellar. All at once he let go and went down the stairs in the dark. Echoes and reverberations from Grandpa's movement could still be felt throughout the house. Goldie began her cautious descent. Upon reaching the bottom, the flashlight revealed what you'd expect in a cellar. There were some dusty boxes, old trunks, cobwebs stretching between forgotten storage items. But just a little beyond the steps, things were far from ordinary. The room expanded into a larger space, the walls made of cold, wet stone, reminiscent of ancient dungeons from old stories. The defining feature of this room was what looked like an old prison cell, its thick bars going from wall to wall, intense dark metal that seemed to absorb the light. The child ran around the room, lighting candles, allowing Goldie to eventually see it all at once. Behind the bars, to Goldie's horror, were the remnants of what looked like a child's life. There were toys scattered across the floor, a small, well-worn bed, and a pile of old, dirty blankets in the corner. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the story of this hidden prison. Why was it here? Was it for this child? However, before she could think any further, the child ran straight towards the cage. It was like he was compelled, driven by some unknown force to get inside. He began trying to pull the heavy metal bar door closed. Goldie stepped forward. "Wait, what are you doing?" she whispered in her trembling voice. The child looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "It's safest here," he replied, his voice quivering. "When the bells ring, it's the most dangerous time. We have to stay here till morning." Goldie grabbed him and tried to pull him out of the cage, but suddenly the boy's demeanor changed. Panic took over, and he lashed out at her, biting her hand with a surprising strength. Goldie, shocked and in pain, released her grip, and the child retreated further into the depths of the cage, hiding beneath the small bed. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Every exhale sounded like a plea for help. Goldie nursed her bitten hand. Her heart raced, every beat echoing the mounting dread inside of her. A bone-chilling roar resonated through the house, a terrifying mix of raw power and anger. As the reverberation subsided, 2 more roars answered from the distance outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy lumbering footsteps rushing towards the house. Goldie, paralyzed with fear, looked up at the ceiling. She could hear the sound of the front door being pounded. With every blow, the cellar ceiling would shake like it was made of cardboard. This continued until Goldie heard a loud crack. It was the sharp noise of the front door shattering, sending splinters and echoes in all directions. Goldie's gaze darted around, searching for a way out, a safe spot. But the scratching and pounding at the cellar door confirmed her fears. They were cornered. In a desperate move, Goldie bolted to the prison cell and closed the heavy metal door. The child continued to hide under the small bed. There wasn't much space in the prison cell, but the thick bars were her only protection from the monstrosities. Goldie tried to focus on what the child had said. They'd be safe in the morning, but the ringing bells were dangerous. What ringing bells? Was there a church somewhere? Maybe an alarm of some sort. Then, her thoughts, the child's screams, and the banging against the door were all interrupted by the melodious chime of a grandfather clock. It was the bells the child had mentioned. Goldie was sure of it, because after the child had heard the bells, he began screaming even louder. As if on cue, another deafening roar tore through the room, followed by the sound of the cellar door being violently thrust open. Goldie's heart pounded even harder, her breaths coming in short gasps. With no other option, she grabbed the collection of dirty old blankets and draped them over herself, huddling in the corner, desperately praying she'd remain unseen. From her makeshift hiding spot, she peeked through a tiny gap in the blankets. 2 monstrous figures stormed down the steps. They looked like bears, but their jaws were wider, and their teeth looked more monstrous. Their hulking bodies cast immense shadows across the room. Goldie could feel herself completely vibrating in fear as she watched the 2 creatures clawing and slamming against the cage's bars, each blow causing the metal to resonate with a hollow clang. But the bars and stone held firm. Then the 2 creatures stopped completely. The boy continued screaming, but upstairs, movement could be heard again. Something was coming to the cellar. Goldie watched in terror as a third figure emerged from the staircase. It was bigger, its fur grayer, its muscles more pronounced. Its eyes looked like they held an evil secret. The two moved aside, seeming to respect the larger monstrosity. The child's warning echoed in Goldie's mind. Grandpa. It was the elder of the beast, and clearly the alpha. Goldie held her breath, hoping the blankets would shield her from their eyes and noses. She clutched them tighter, feeling the cold stone of the wall against her back. The alpha took several swings at the cage with its massive claws, but the bars held strong. Having a little confidence in the bars, Goldie began to breathe a little. She shifted the blankets to see what was going on with the child under the bed, who was still screaming. But what she saw was not the innocent child she met earlier. In the dim light, she could see him convulsing violently. His small frame began to enlarge and distort. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur quickly covered his body, and his screams became guttural growls. Before her very eyes, the child was transforming into a creature eerily similar to those outside of the cell. A werebear. She watched horrified as the metamorphosis completed. The once familiar face of the boy was now completely gone, replaced by the face of a young, but equally ferocious monster. The final chime of the clock signified the end of the transformation. With his instincts driven by newfound hunger and the primal urges of his monstrous form, the child-turned-werebear turned its attention to Goldie. In one swift motion, the creature lunged at Goldie. The blankets offered little resistance, and her terrified screams mixed with the triumphant roars of the werebears outside. The horror she felt was now overshadowed by the brutal reality of the cruel twist of fate that led her to this end.
And that brings us to the end of our fairy tale nightmares for Day 12, Horror Fam. I hope you enjoyed the darker side of these classic stories. Tonight's been a journey through the twisted and unexpected. Fairy tales will never feel quite the same now, will they? Also, be sure to join us tomorrow for even more spine-chilling tales as we continue our Halloween countdown. Until then, stay spooky, stay safe, and as always, take good care of yourselves.